All right, welcome out. This is another video in the series of economic videos. This is one I promised previously. We've already talked about economics in general. We listened to Ha-Joon Chang talk about some economic basics in his video, Economics is for Everyone. Economics is for Everyone is a great book that you should read along with Common Sense Economics. And again, I am not the expert. That's why I go to the experts. Another great one is Professor Anthony Davies. Uh, he's been teaching for maybe 15, 20 years. Really knows his stuff. This is the guy that I go to. I've listened to maybe a dozen or so of his videos. So this one, 10 Myths About the Government Debt, kind of covers gets into, I should say, a deeper look at some of the basic myths, issues, concerns in regard to debt, inflation, taxes, taxation, and things of that nature. A lot of depressing information, sad, not glad information, right? But at the end, there is a solution, and the solution is pretty easy to understand. And it's also very succinct and short-lived. It's not something that will take decades, just a matter of years to fix this problem. But then the problem is that you have to make sure that those in government are interested in really fixing the problem and not in politicking, because politicking is often not about not spending. It's about spending to gain favors and to gain constituents and so forth. So that's an issue. He doesn't talk too much about that. He just talks about the solution. But anyways, let's take a look at the 10 myths. There's a lot here, so let's just begin.
Myths about the government debt. Myth number one, the government owes $20 trillion.
Case in point of note, this was made in 2017. So this is 7 years old. If he talks about 20 trillion in debt, if I can, you can see the current U.S. national debt clock. If you're ever feeling good, having a good life, and you're feeling happy, just come here. It'll immediately take you down. You can see over up here, U.S. national debt, 35 trillion. Debt per citizen. This is debt per citizen, not per working citizen. So if each citizen, and if you put it in terms of working citizen, then you probably have to triple that number. So for each working citizen, if each working citizen paid $300,000, we could pretty much eliminate the debt. But who has $300,000 just spare money hanging around, right? So that's the issue right now. We're at 35 trillion.
How much is $20 trillion? Suppose you go to Germany, and in Germany, you go to every town, and in every town, you visit every store, and in every store, you look at every shelf and grab everything that is for sale. The amount of money you spend will not be $20 trillion. If you go to Germany and then to France, and you go to every town, and within every town, you go to every store, and every store, you look at every shelf, and you buy everything, you still will not have spent $20 trillion. You can go to England, and while you're there, you can go to the North countries and buy everything that's for sale, and you still will not have spent $20 trillion. In fact, to spend $20 trillion, you have to go to every country in Europe, visit every town, and every town, go to every store, in every store, look on every shelf, and buy everything. And then you will have spent about $20 trillion. But the myth is that this is how much money the government owes.
Point of note, as I said, we currently owe about $35 trillion. Another way to look at this is if you were to count all of that money, say you wanted to sit down and count 35 trillion, how long would it take you? So this kind of puts into perspective, because once you get to a trillion, that number for most people is just unfathomable, right? Maybe we can understand hundreds and thousands, maybe even millions, but maybe even billions, but trillions, that just kind of escapes most people's reality. Okay. So anyways, if you were going to count $35 trillion It would take you about 1.1 million years to count all that money. That's how big those numbers are, just to put it in perspective.
It turns out that there's more, called unfunded obligations. Unfunded obligations is money the federal government has promised, but which it does not and will not have the money to pay. Largely, this consists of promises of retirement and medical benefits. If you take the present value of all the future promises of retirement and medical benefits the government has made and subtract from that the amount of money that's in the government's Social Security and Medicare trust funds, and then subtract from that the amount of money the federal government anticipates collecting under the current law from future Social Security and Medicare taxes, you will still have an amount of money left over that the government does not have. And
unfunded obligations. Okay. So a couple of things. First of all, trust funds. Trust funds are funds, and it's right there, defined right in that word trust, are funds that are trusted to a particular entity, in this case, the government. The government, we trust our Social Security and Medicare and so forth funds to the government, that they will manage that money properly and distribute it properly and so forth, right? So you have the present value of future retirement medical benefits, Social Security, Medicare trust funds, that's the money that's sitting there waiting for you, hopefully, potentially, right? Present value of future Social Security and Medicare taxes. And all of that equals unfunded obligations. And that number is considerably large.
And that's the unfunded obligations, an amount of money the government has promised, which it does not and will not have the money to pay. Estimates of unfunded obligations vary from the astronomical to the unbelievable. On the low end, people have estimated unfunded obligations to be about $80 trillion. On the high end, $200 trillion. So this means that the federal government's total financial obligations range somewhere from $100 to $220 trillion. Let's say, roughly speaking, the federal government owes about $150 trillion. Myth number two, the government owes $150 trillion. Well, it turns out there's more to it. There are federal agencies that don't appear on the federal government's budget. There are government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that don't appear on the government's financial statements, and they owe another $8 trillion.
Interesting. So why is it, or why is this allowed to occur, that there are certain entities, certain monies that are not showing up on the budget or are not taken into consideration? You know, if a private business did that, that would be called cooking the books, right? We're not putting down certain expenses. We just don't want to list them for whatever reason, usually beneficial to the enterprise itself, right? So why is that happening? What is the government doing? This is another issue of concern. What is the government doing? What do you know about what the government is doing? Where is it going? And this is essential for you to know, me too, anyone who is an adult, voting age, American citizens. It's important for you to know because you want to know what your government's doing with your money. I've heard some people say that it doesn't matter who's president. From one president to another to the next, things remain the same. Well, they don't. In some regard, and they do in other regards. For instance, in this regard, this stuff has been going on for quite some time. Nobody knows about it. Nobody says anything about it. Nobody's interested. Nobody's concerned. Nobody cares. Right? So it's essential to know this stuff because you want to vote in people into power who are going to take care of you, not take care of their constituents or take care of themselves and looking to gain favor, to gain votes, right? Key point.
There's then state and local governments that collectively owe about $3 trillion and have another $5 trillion in their own unfunded obligations. So when we put it all together, the total U.S. governmental financial obligations total about $165 trillion. Myth number three, government borrowed.
And keep in mind, this was 7 years ago, so that number is higher now.
Borrowed from the Social Security Trust Fund isn't really debt because we owe it to ourselves. Well, it turns out there is no ourselves here. The trust fund belongs to current and future retirees. So when people retire and the government does not have the money that it has promised them, one of two things must happen. Either the government must increase taxes on future workers to pay for the Social Security and Medicare obligations it has promised, or the government has to cut the promised Social Security and Medicare benefits that it had promised to retirees.
Interesting point is that in my situation, I think the government is already starting to do this, already starting to cut Social Security payments. There's something called the windfall elimination provision for people who work in the public and private sector. I worked in the private sector for some time. I was a computer programmer, analyst, tech support guy, and then I moved into teaching for 24, 25 years at the college level in higher education. And when I was working in the private sector, I was gaining Social Security income. However, once I moved into the public sector as a teacher, I did not have Social Security was no longer a part of the picture. I was getting a pension through the state. So interestingly enough, and nobody's been able to answer my question as to why this has occurred. Interestingly enough, those people in that situation are penalized. Why? What did I do? I have no idea. So what they do is they end up losing 40% because of the fact that they're straddling two situations, working in the private and public sector, getting Social Security, not getting Social Security, getting a pension. Because you're in that situation, you end up losing 40% of your Social Security. Why? I've talked to my retirement people through the state, state college teachers fund. I've looked up this information, and I've talked to other advisors and financial experts. A lot of them just don't know. They don't know. So what is the government doing? Is it pulling a fast one? Why is it that people who work in the private and public sector are penalized? Why can't those who are earning Social Security and then are not earning Social Security for a certain amount of time, just earning a pension, get 100% of that Social Security? Why? It makes no sense to me. So fortunately, some of these laws are changing. People are becoming aware of some of the inequalities, I guess we could say, in regards to that particular issue. But there's other issues out there, and also, when the government doesn't have money, it's going to do that. It's going to either cut payments to those who the money is owed to, if they don't have it, or they're going to increase taxes to current workers.
Either way, someone must pay.
Someone must pay.
Myth number 4, the government can't go bankrupt. This is technically true because the government promised to pay back a certain number of dollar bills. And so as the government starts to run out of money, it can simply print more, thereby satisfying its obligation. But while that's technically true, it's effectively false, because when the government prints money, it erodes the purchasing power of dollars, thereby creating inflation.
Only the government creates inflation, right? Any economist worth his or her salt will tell you this, right? Where does inflation come from? It comes from the government printing too much money, especially too much money too quickly, and prices going up. And he's got a good example in here of that scenario, that situation occurring. Okay, keep that in mind, right?
For example, suppose you have a bunch of people, and these people buy things. They buy things from Walmart, from McDonald's and Ford, and in buying these things, they give these businesses money. In return, they receive goods and services from these businesses. The ratio of the dollars they pay to the goods and services they receive, we call prices. So we have the average price of a hamburger, the average price of a pair of shoes, the average price of a car. Now, if the government were to print enough money to double the money supply, we would have twice as many dollar bills floating around, but the same amount of goods and services. All that would happen is the prices of these goods and services themselves would double. So with twice as many dollar bills, a hamburger now goes from a price of $4 to a price of $8. The car goes from $30,000 to a price of $60,000. And one of the prices that will double is people's wages. Interestingly, you're left with the following. Under scenario 1, without the government printing money, let's suppose you earn $50,000 a year, and the price of a hamburger, shoes, and a car, things you would buy, are $4,000 30 and 30,000. And then along comes the government and prints lots of money, and in printing the money, it doubles all the prices, including your income. So now in scenario 2, you're earning twice as much as you were before, $100,000, but the prices of the things you buy have all doubled as well. And so if I ask you, are you better off in scenario 1 or scenario 2? The answer is you're the same in both.
And this is what is called secondary effects. Those effects that occur that often aren't spoken to because politicians want to do certain things. And if they told you the whole truth or told you everything that was going on, what they were doing wouldn't appear in such a positive light. And as far as their political future was concerned, might be in dire straits, right? So being honest for most politicians, many politicians, it's not advantageous, to be honest, if you want to move forward in the political realm. So that is an issue. It's kind of like unemployment. It's kind of like minimum wage. You know, cost of living keeps going up, keeps going up, keeps going up because of inflation, because of the government borrowing too much money. So instead of minimum wage being $10, let's make it 15, let's make it 20, let's make it 30. When one thing happens, there's usually a secondary effect, maybe one or two or several things happening. When the minimum wage goes up, most companies, about 98% of companies are small businesses, right? Even the larger companies would have a tough time surviving if unemployment payments went up, double, say or maybe 50%. Minimum wage is $10 and then it goes up to $15, right? Even for large companies, that would be a pretty hard bill to pay, difficult bill to pay or to overcome, because of the fact that payroll is almost always the biggest expense for any business, right? And for small businesses, 98% of all businesses are small businesses. It would put them out of business if all of a sudden they had to pay everybody an additional $5 an hour who is minimum wage or usually part-time, some full-time. So what do? Well, what has occurred recently in California as minimum wage has gone up? More part-time jobs, fewer full-time jobs, fewer benefits, higher prices, automation. So these are the secondary effects occur when, for instance, when I keep on saying when minimum wage is increased, right? So keep that in mind. Secondary effects. This is critical thinking at its best. When you hear something, if it sounds too good to be true, be careful, be leery, because of the fact that there's almost always something lurking underneath that negates all that happiness and joy and good time flavor. Okay.
Doesn't matter to you whether you're earning $50,000 and a car costs 30, or whether you're earning $100,000 and a car costs 60. It's the same car. Now, there is a difference in the two scenarios, and the difference shows up when you look at your savings. Let's suppose in scenario 1, you had $10,000 in savings, you're earning $50,000, and a hamburger costs 4. Along comes the government, it prints money, and in printing money, all the prices double. That means that the hamburger now costs twice as much, the shoes cost twice as much, you're earning twice as much, but your savings is the same. It's the same $10,000 sitting in savings. And what has happened when the government comes along and prints money, in effect, what it's doing is draining away the purchasing power of your savings. So economists say it this way: inflation is a tax on savings. When the government prints money and thereby creates inflation, we get the same exact effect as if the government had imposed a tax on people's savings. So the fact is that the government ultimately pays for bankruptcy by taxing the purchasing power of people's savings.
So the only thing that comes out of printing money, it seems, is a negative, a pretty big negative, right? And this is why I've said before, savings, Napoleon Hill talks about saving for a rainy day. It's important that you have savings. Nowadays, especially with inflation and the fact that the value of the dollar has dropped so much, it's become very weak. Banks are just not giving enough of a interest rate to really make a difference, right? I talked about this before. It used to be, I remember banks used to give you 3, 4, 5, 6% on your savings. Now it's what, 0.5%? If you can get 1%, you're doing well, right? So, you get 0.5% on the money that you're putting into the bank that is already inflated 3 or 4%. So instead of saying, say it's at 3%. So instead of losing 3%, you're only losing 2.5% with a 0.5% interest rate. Yes. These are the things you need to know. This is the financial stuff you need to know. And again, I'm not a financial expert. I don't know as much as Professor Davies knows or Ha-Joon Chang knows. But and Ha-Joon Chang talks about the fact that why is it that people, average citizen, feels uncomfortable talking about or knowing or having opinion about economic issues? Well, you should. It's because it's very important. Money, your money, your ability to not only thrive but survive during the working years and through the retirement years is essential. This stuff is essential, right? Again, that's all the stuff I'm teaching. Essential. What do most people need most of the time, most situations? Essential, right? The essentials. Let's go with those.
Myth number 5. The government can solve its financial problems by raising taxes. Well, it turns out the government can't raise taxes at all. It can only raise tax rates. Taxes are what happens when the tax rate the government imposed interacts with people's behavior. This is perhaps the most interesting picture in all of economics.
And then he puts up there, fix the problem by raising taxes. It should be by raising tax rates. Well, I guess that was the poorly stated statement there is how people often will mistake that myth. The myth is wrong and it's also misstated. So 2 wrongs make a right? No.
And it's interesting precisely because it's so boring. What you're seeing here is federal tax receipts. This is all tax revenue from all sources combined: payroll taxes, income taxes, estate taxes, tariffs, everything. Federal taxes, all sources combined, as a fraction of GDP. And what you see is from 1950 up to the present, this has remained relatively stable at about 17%.
You know what's funny? It seems like when the government gets involved and attempts to fix something, most of their attempts at fixing kind of flatline. In the 60s, Lyndon Baines Johnson, began his war against poverty. And all types of programs and things were signed into being and existence. And since that time, poverty has stayed about the same at the same level. No matter what the government does. They can talk a great talk, but do they walk the walk? A lot of times, no, which is sad. Another good, important thing to know.
That is, over time, if you think of the economy as a pie, the government has collected a constant 17% slice of this economic pie. Now, let's superimpose on top of this, for example, the top marginal income tax rate. So back in the 1950s, the top marginal income tax rate was north of 90%. It dropped in the 1960s, reached an all-time low during the Reagan years, goes back.
So that's the taxing of the rich usually. And back in the 50s, we had just come out of World War II, and the 30s also was a bad time, the Great Depression, and then World War II, all the costs of battling a war, had to be paid for. So I'm pretty sure that's pretty much why the 90%, for the higher tax rate. And then it went down to 70 in the 60s, 70s, and then Reagan cut taxes. And people talked about Reagan cutting taxes for the rich. Did it really do anything? Apparently not. Didn't help much at all. So what is our government doing? Is it a bunch of smoke and mirrors? Are they just doing stuff that appears to be good, appears to be for the people, Are they doing stuff without telling you the full truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth? Are they missing that secondary information or those secondary occurrences and not giving you the full picture, not being honest, not telling you everything? This is why you need to know and not rely on those in government to tell you the truth or the full picture. This is why you need to know this stuff. You need to know it.
Up during Bush the first, comes back down, goes back up again. This is the top marginal income tax rate. So when we talk about taxing the rich, this is the rate that applies to the rich. But notice what happens here. In years in which we tax the rich at a very high rate, the government collected 17% of the economy as tax revenue. And in years in which we lowered the tax rate on the rich, the government still collected 17% of the economy as tax revenue. And the same is true of, for example, the capital gains rate. When capital gains taxes were particularly high, the government collected 17% of the economy.
Capital gains is when you sell something that you've bought for investment purposes, usually. Stocks, bonds, real estate, you buy that stuff and then you sell it. You are affixed a capital gains tax. Government's always going to get you.
Economy is tax
Or
revenue.
as you say, the government's always going to get its fair share, get its share. I don't know.
When capital gains taxes were particularly low, the government collected 17% of the economy as tax revenue. The same is true of the average effective corporate tax rate. When corporations paid higher fractions of their profits to the federal government collected 17% of the economy as tax revenue. When tax rates on corporations were lower, the government still collected the same 17% of the economy as tax revenue. It didn't matter whether we taxed the rich or capital gains or corporations. It didn't matter whether we taxed them a high amount or we taxed them a low amount. Regardless of what the government has done, historically, it has consistently collected the same 17% of the economy as tax revenue. Now, you might say, all right, but we're looking at tax revenue as a fraction of GDP.
And he doesn't explain this, but I'm going to make a guess, an uneducated guess, kind of a rookie. I'll take a rookie shot at this. It stays at 17%. The thing about government debt or about debt in general is that, like your credit card, you don't have to pay it all off, right? You just have to pay the minimum monthly payment. So I think that's what the government, that's all they're worried about, is making the minimum monthly payments on the debt. And meanwhile, they can kind of, raise this and lower that for political purposes. If I want constituents or if I want voters from this segment or that segment of the society or that segment, I'll do this. I'll raise taxes. I'll lower taxes to get more votes. So it seems like a lot of it, it's just smoke and mirrors. It doesn't follow through. Like for instance, the government not putting all of its expenses on the books, as we talked about earlier. Odd stuff. He doesn't talk about that, but I'll have to look into that.
GDP. Tell me what's happening to tax revenue straight up. So let's look at what happens to tax revenue as tax rates change. What you see here is the top marginal income tax rate. This is data from 1940 to 2015. So across the bottom, as we move to the right, we're taxing the rich at a higher rate. As we move to the left, we're taxing the rich at a lower rate. Up and down, we're measuring tax revenue per person 1 year later. So this is total federal tax revenue on a per capita basis 1 year after the tax rate goes into effect. And this is all adjusted for inflation. The story we hear when we hear things like, well, we need more tax revenue, so we need to tax the rich more. Implicit in that statement is, as you increase the tax rate on the rich, we will collect more tax revenue. But if we actually look at the data, what we see is a different picture. The actual data looks like this. On average, as we have increased the tax rate on the rich, 1 year later, the federal government has actually collected, on average, less tax revenue. There are exceptions to this, but there's also a very clear trend that the tax revenue moves in the opposite direction that we think it should.
Another thing is, let me put my amateur guesses to effect here. Another thing is if taxes are raised, especially on the wealthy, and the wealthy usually own businesses and real estate and whatnot, right? They have investments. If taxes are raised, say up to 90%, that's the top marginalized tax rate, right? Do you think a a wealthy person is just going to keep paying 90%? No, they're going to do something, cut expenses, reinvest, maybe send manufacturing overseas. Manufacturing, again, is one of the most expensive aspects of running any business, especially for large businesses, corporations. That's why they send them overseas. It's just too expensive. The cost, the taxes, right, are too expensive. And you keep in-house, production, not production, but the design and maybe accounting and some less expensive things, right? So maybe that's what's happening too, because companies just don't stop moving. If taxes are raised or I should say tax rates, the tax rates are raised or lowered, usually, like an individual, a company will do something. And a company has all kinds of lawyers and tax accountants. They're going to do something, right? They're not just going to, oh, 90%? Yeah, I'll just keep paying 90%. No problem. They have to protect themselves. They have to guard against imminent economic collapse. So I really don't know how the government thinks that they can charge 90%, tax rate, or even 70%. That's ridiculously high. These companies are going to do something. And then people talk about all these corporations, they're evil. They're sending their manufacturing work overseas to the poor and working them in sweatshops and paying them way below the margin, what would be made or charged in the United States, right? Well, it's survival. That's one aspect of the situation that a lot of people don't think about. Again, not thinking about the secondary effects. That's not very good critical thinking, right?
And this is not just true of the top marginal income tax rate. We also see it if we look at the capital gains tax rate. Now, the relationship here is not as tight, but it's disturbingly in the same direction. On average, as the government has increased the capital gains tax rate, 1 year later, it has collected less tax revenue than it did before. We see the same phenomenon with the corporate profits tax. We see the same thing with the estate tax. In fact, of all the federal taxes, I'm only aware of two, which historically, as the government has increased these tax rates, its tax revenue has actually gone up. And those two taxes are Social Security and Medicare. The disturbing part of this is these are the taxes that fall most heavily on the poor and the middle class. Myth number 6, the rich aren't paying their fair share. What constitutes a fair share? What you see here is average market income of various income groups in the United States as of 2013. So we have the poorest 20% of Americans at the top. Their market income, that is income they earn from participating in market activities as opposed to money the government gives them. Americans, their average income is about $53,000, and the top 1% just over $1.5 million. So let's ask, what is a fair tax rate for these people to pay? As we talk about tax rates, let's talk about effective tax rates. And what I mean by that is after you have done all of your legal and accounting gymnastics and write-offs and deductions and exemptions, when all that's finished, what fraction of your income did you end up paying to the IRS? That's the effective tax rate. So we can argue about what constitutes fair. A lot of people tend to answer the following way. The poor should probably pay somewhere around 2%. A lot of people think that the middle class Americans should pay around 15%. And a lot of people think that the top 1% should pay around 30% of their income as taxes. Now, we can argue about whether these things are indeed fair, but these seem to be numbers that lots of people will tend to agree with. So let's look at what these groups actually pay. If we look at the federal taxes collected from each of these groups, we see something like the following. The average household amongst the poorest 20% of Americans pays, on average, $800 in federal taxes. The average middle income household in the United States pays about $9,000 in taxes, and the average household amongst the top 1% pays about $500,000 in federal taxes. Now, this isn't the end of the story, because we don't just pay money to the federal government. The federal government also gives money back. A lot of this comes in the form of the Earned Income Tax Credit, or Social Security benefits or unemployment compensation. But all of these things are instances in which the government has first collected money and then turned around and given the money back. So let's account for this. And economists call this transfers. Transfers are money the government gives to people. The average household amongst the poorest 20% received an average federal transfer of about $9,600 in 2013. The average middle-income household received about $16,700. The average top 1%er earned about $800. Most of that is likely coming from Social Security retirement benefits. But notice what happens now. If we calculate the effective tax rate by accounting not just for what people pay to the government, but for the money the government pays them back, what we find is something astounding. We claimed that a fair tax rate for the poorest Americans is 2% and a fair tax rate for the top 1% is 30%. If we run these numbers, what we find is the poorest 20% on average are actually paying negative 56%. That is, when all the dust settles, they're actually receiving more money back from the federal government than they paid in the first place, making their effective tax rate below zero. This is true all the way up through middle-income America. The average middle-income American is receiving back 15% more from the federal government than he paid in. The top 1% are paying about 34%. And here we have an interesting conclusion. On average, and there are exceptions, but on average, only the top 40% are net payers into the federal government.
Key point, secondary effects. So people talk about taxes, federal taxes. The poor pay the most, the middle class pay the most. They may, we just disregard these numbers, even if they do pay more than the wealthy, and since the wealthy makes more money, little chance of that happening, right, on average. Nobody talks about the transfers. The government gives back a lot of money, right? If you're unemployed, you get money from the government. If you collect Social Security, if you collect Medicare, Medicaid, there's all these, like WIC is another one for pregnant women. There's all of these social safety net programs that the government is paying back or transferring money back to the taxpayer. So you got to look at the full picture. You got to be a comprehensive critical thinker, and this is basically critical thinking at its best. When you listen to the same thing with Ha-Joon Chang, I was mentioning how well he was using critical thinking to think things through, logically, comprehensively, objectively, humbly, right, and so forth.
And this raises an interesting point, because every time someone says, well, we should cut taxes, someone else responds with, well, you mean tax cuts for the rich. But in fact, our tax system, at least at the federal level, has become so progressive that virtually every tax cut, by definition, is a tax cut for the rich, because on average, those are the only people who are actually paying. Myth number 7, the government can settle its debts by selling off its assets. The government has debts and unfunded obligations of about $150 trillion, but it's also sitting on a bunch of assets, 8,000 tons of gold in Fort Knox, 500 million acres of land out in the West and Midwest, and then miscellaneous assets on top of that. And these total actually only about $2 or $3 trillion. So when we're done, even if the federal government were to sell off all of its assets, we still have a shortfall of $147 trillion. Myth number 8, the government needs to pay off its debts. The good news here is the government actually doesn't need to pay off its debt. Just as a household with a credit card does not have to pay off the credit card, all it has to do is keep up with the minimum monthly payments. So too, the government only needs to keep up with its minimum monthly payments. We call this servicing the debt. The bad news is, if we count all of the money the federal government owes, $150 trillion, and the federal government currently pays about 2.5% on its debt, to service the full $150 trillion of obligations, the federal government would have to come up with $3.8 trillion per year. That is, to service the debt and obligations the federal government currently has, it would have to pay $3.8 trillion a year in interest. And yet, the federal government's annual income is only about 3.3 trillion. That is, the federal government actually is bankrupt right now. Even if it were to devote all of the tax revenue it collects solely to servicing its $150 trillion in debt and obligations, it still would not have enough money to service that debt.
Not even close, just a small fraction of it. So the government doesn't have money. The government actually is in debt. The Federal Reserve, the central bank, has no money. People think that the banks have money. Even your public banks, your Bank of America, your U.S. bank, they don't have money, right? These are the things you need to know about. Instead of just kind of swimming through murky waters, economic murky waters or litigious murky waters, you really need to know some things. You need to know something about the laws of the land, the Constitution, Constitutional Republic, and you also need to know something about economics for your own sake, and also making decisions at the local, state, and federal level as well.
Myth number 9, well, the government could just keep on borrowing. The problem here is the government has borrowed so much money that it's running out of places to find more. Currently, the American people, state and local governments have loaned about $6 trillion to the federal government. Social Security, Medicare, Veterans Benefits Trust Funds have loaned about $5 trillion to the federal government. Foreign governments have loaned another $4 trillion. The Federal Reserve has loaned $3 trillion. And foreign people have loaned about $2 trillion.
All right, so we talked about this in the last video. Monetized debt. Here's a nice breakdown. Here's a nice graphic of where all the money is coming from. So when our government wants to do something, when it wants to pay the people for unemployment, when it wants to fund certain programs, when it wants to pay for infrastructure, when it wants to pay for roads, pay for schools, whatever, right? Whatever, wars, military funding, whatever, it has to basically raise money. It's going to produce loans that it sells. It sells debt, right? Those treasury bills, right? The 3 types of treasury bills ranging from 1 year to 30 years, right? So these T-bills are the vehicles through which our government pays for things, right? So who's buying the treasury bills? American people, state and local governments, Social Security and Medicare are buying the debt to pay for those programs. And as we know, they don't have enough money as it is now. Foreign governments, we talked about, I think Japan and China are the biggest players. That's about half of that, 4 trillion. The Federal Reserve, the central bank, and also foreign people, right? Foreign wealthy individuals usually.
This is the total amount of money that people the world over have loaned to the federal government. The problem with this is Social Security, Medicare, Veterans Benefits Trust Funds have run out of money. They have no more left to loan to the federal government. In fact, in the case of Social Security and Medicare, they're starting to pull back the money that they had loaned to the federal government, which they now need to turn over to retirees in the form of benefits. Foreign governments and foreign people have been slowing the growth of their lending to the federal government. The American people, state and local governments have been slowing, in some cases, actually cutting back.
And we talked about this. They're cutting back, right? Foreign governments, foreign people, other entities are not buying as much debt or as many treasury bills as they used to because they see that the United States is getting into trouble, it's going way too much into debt. 35 trillion, right? That's way too much. It went from 20 trillion to 35 trillion, as we see here, in just 7 years. So where are we going to be in another 7 years? And is the United States going to be able to pay the bills when the bills come due, or those treasury bills, right? After a year, 5 year, 10 year, 30 years, is the United States going to have the money to pay for those loans or investments, I should say, and also pay interest on top of that? So, investors, foreign and national, otherwise, they see what's going on. So they're not as, even though the U.S. is usually a good bet, a safe bet, because it has been paying its bills, but as it takes on more and more debt, the opportunity to pay and continue to pay uh, becomes damaged, or becomes less, is mitigated, becomes less and less.
Back on how much they loan the federal government. And that means that as time moves forward and the federal government wants to borrow more and more money, and these groups are all tending to cut back on how much they loan, the one place left the federal government can turn to for money is the Federal Reserve. And the problem here is when the government borrows from the Federal Reserve, unlike its borrowing from any of these other groups, it creates inflation. And inflation is a tax on savings. So in effect, as the federal government runs out of places to borrow, it must turn to the Federal Reserve to borrow money. And when it does that, it creates inflation, which erodes the purchasing power of all of our savings. Myth number 10, there's no way to fix this problem.
The good news.
It turns out that there is. We could have a balanced budget within 5 years if we followed this recipe. First, cut all spending this year by 10%, no exceptions. And if there's some things you don't want to cut by 10%, then cut something else by more, so that when you're done, in total, you have cut by 10%. And when I say cut by 10%, I mean the word in the way any normal human being uses it. When politicians say cut the budget, what they mean is to increase the budget by less than they would actually like. This is an actual 10% cut. We spend 10% less than we did the year before. Then hold spending constant for 4 years. Don't even adjust for inflation. What happens over these 4 years is as the government holds its spending constant, the economy continues to grow. And at the end of the 5th year, the economy is now large enough that it can support the government that exists. At the end of the 5th year, we'll have our first balanced budget. Thereafter, the federal government can continue to increase its spending if it likes, provided that the increase does not outpace the growth rate of the economy as a whole. This solution stops the bleeding. It prevents the debt problem from getting worse, but it doesn't solve the debt problem. However, we can grow out of this. It took perhaps 100 years for our debt problem to grow to the size it is now. If we can stop the problem from getting worse over the course of the next 50 or 100 years, the economy will grow enough that the current $150 trillion debt won't matter.
All right, so that's it. It was kind of a long video, but nevertheless, essential information. There's a couple more people that I want, economists that I want to expose you to. One is Thomas Sowell, and the other is Milton Friedman. So I will do some work with each one of those gentlemen, and then as far as economics is concerned, we'll move on from there. There might be the occasional video talking about current economic issues, but as for the basic background intro stuff, that'll be it. All right. So that's it for today. Have a good day and stay out of trouble.